When my child was 6 months old, he was afraid of white people. Let me paint the picture for you. He's a bit of a pandemic baby, born about 3 months before COVID. The week that I was supposed to return to work, lockdown hit, and we became very socially isolated as a family to protect ourselves and our loved ones. So for the first 9 months of his life, all he knew was mommy who was Indian, daddy who was black, toys, books, and media that were very intentionally representative of those communities. When he was about 6 months old, we took a walk in the neighborhood, and we ran into a white neighbor, and he lost his mind in fear. Now, this was a very unusual response for him because he's usually a very friendly and social child. So we thought maybe this was a one-off, but it happened again and again. That's when I remembered the developmental science. Children as young as 4 to 6 months old notice race-based differences. By the time a child is 2 to 4 years old, they develop racial biases. And by the time a child is 10 to 12 years old, they internalize those racial biases. Now, these biases are informed by a whole host of things. They include parental biases, access to diverse content, socialization opportunities, and these biases go on to influence us for generations to come. This experience with my child taught me so much and really illustrated developmental science and real happenings. Don't worry, since then he has adapted and socialized. He has several friends from many different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and he no longer holds those fears. What doesn't always happen, though, is the reverse. White children don't always have opportunities for socialization or discussion of differences. In fact, recent statistics show that 75% of white people have white-only social networks. I'm a clinical psychologist, and for a majority of my career, I have worked with young children providing therapy, education, coaching, and conducting research on social and emotional skills. And what I love about this population is the unfiltered naivety and the inevitable comments about physical differences. I think back to my first year of training when a 4-year-old boy commented, "Your skin is brown." Now, he was only doing what most of the kids his age are trying to do, which is organize the world around him, comment on the differences that he's seeing. But I wasn't prepared for those comments. I wasn't ready to address the questions that came. And most adults never are, because we're never provided resources or opportunities to practice how to have these discussions. In fact, we are told that speaking about race or culture is taboo for young children, that children aren't ready. But the reality is they are, and they want this information. Children learn through explicit dialogue. It's us adults who feel uncomfortable having these conversations. We fear that maybe we're going to project our own biases or we're going to cause harm. But what we need to do is create safe spaces for dialogue. Because what will happen if we avoid these conversations is children will grow to develop biases that either intentionally or unintentionally cause harm and impact the mental health and well-being of marginalized communities. These kids may grow to say things like, "I don't see color." Although well-intentioned, color blindness erases the existence of a marginalized individual. It says, "We don't see you fully." These micro and macro experiences of oppression have a stress-based response on the body that impacts our mental and our physical health. So several studies have documented that the experiences of racism and discrimination have a trauma-based response that manifests as anxiety and depression, difficulties with concentration, trouble with sleep and appetite. And these long-term toxic stressors can have profound impacts on health outcomes as well, placing an individual at risk for heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. And what if I told you that these experiences with oppression are not just an individual process, but that we have generational impacts that are passed on through our parenting practices and our genetics? We have documentation that the collective experiences of things like the Holocaust, colonization of indigenous peoples, and the enslavement of Black communities has profound impacts on mental and physical health decades and centuries later. Essentially, the way in which your grandparents parented your parents influences how your parents parented you, and ultimately will impact how you parent your children if you don't engage in healing practices. And these influences are not just through our parenting behaviors, but through our genes. This is where a therapist comes in. So I think back to 2020, the height of the racial reckoning we were experiencing in this country, when I was working clinically with a 4-year-old biracial child who was coming in for concerns related to anxiety. During our clinical intervention, he asked me, "Can I change the color of my skin?" As we unpacked the statement, it became clear that the root of his anxiety was related to him being a child of color, given the current events. And this fear that he held was not a fear that he alone had. This was a fear that his family shared as well. And they didn't know how to navigate these discussions or how to cope with those emotions themselves. And as we unpacked further, it became clear that the school this child attended was operating on implicit biases that exacerbated this anxiety response in this child. So the goal of treatment became creating a safe space for this child to navigate his cultural identity while building coping resources, while simultaneously equipping his family with coping tools to navigate these discussions as he continues through development, because they will inevitably face more discrimination and oppression over the years. And my role as a psychologist doesn't end in the therapy room. My role as a psychologist also includes advocating for this child in his school, in his community, and beyond. So it was also my job to provide resources for the school on how to manage their implicit biases and avoid causing harm. This case is just a classic example of how children don't operate in silos. They're impacted by a number of factors, including their families, their neighborhoods, and larger cultural influences. Mental health needs are deeply systemic, yet none of our existing mental health interventions effectively address community-level systemic care. In fact, we ask ourselves often why it is that historically marginalized groups are so disparate in their health outcomes. Why are there so many negative factors for these communities? When we have the answers right in front of us. We know that psychologists can operate as holistic healing sources that not only treats the individual, but works to dismantle and restructure systems that are causing harm to communities of color or marginalized communities. We also know that we have to have conversations regarding culture early and often as we do this advocacy work to restructure these systems. So what can we do as an individual? Because this task of tackling systems can sometimes feel really daunting. But I have a few points that I could summarize for you to do, because we all have roles in the systems we operate in. First, start by acknowledging your implicit biases. We all have them. Even those of us from marginalized communities have learning to do. So become aware of your blind spots. Engage with communities that are different from your own. Second, make space for conversations about race and culture, especially with your children. Create opportunities for dialogue that are judgment-free and provide them with access to diverse content. This is how children learn. 3, be open, critical, and flexible. Be critical of our existing mental health systems, because what we have currently isn't working for many. Be open to the idea that mental health and wellness can look different across communities, and open to the idea of new and innovative approaches. One size does not fit all. And advocate for systems-level change. Use your voice and ensure that we are incorporating priorities related to culturally responsive care. When approaching conversations of race, a quote often comes to mind. Reading about mountain climbing doesn't make a mountain climber. Similarly, reading about injustice doesn't make a social justice advocate or a change maker. We're past a time of learning and we're in a time of action. So, will you be reading or will you be climbing? Thank you.